Each one of the Gospels tells the story of Jesus a little uniquely. And each one of the Gospels unfolds Jesus' life in a slightly different way. One of the ways this happens is that each one of the Gospels has a story. Each one of the Gospels includes a narrative in which Jesus kind of makes his debut. Each one of the Gospels has a story where Jesus enters the scene and announces himself in some way. In the Gospel of John, Jesus really makes his debut at the wedding at Cana, where he turns the water into wine. In the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, Jesus has his coming out moment in extended stories about Jesus' baptism and the ways he called his first disciples. And in the Gospel of Luke, it happens in this moment that Jeff just read about, this moment told in the Gospel of Luke when Jesus stood up in his hometown synagogue and he read from the scroll of Isaiah, this moment when Jesus felt all the eyes of his hometown friends and neighbors resting on him, and when he felt both their wonder and pride and their skepticism and doubt fall on him. This story that Jeff read is Jesus' debut story. It's his coming out party. It's Jesus' big premiere. And it's the moment in Luke's gospel when Jesus gets to say for himself what he thinks he is on the earth to do. We here in the 21st century, we tend to have a pretty expansive view of what we think Jesus was on earth to do. 20 centuries later, we have a pretty broad sense of how and why Jesus was important. We think he was important. How and why Jesus showed up to make a difference in the world. But it's worth noticing that in this passage, Jesus only names 5 things. We could probably put our heads together and come up with a list of dozens of things that were important about Jesus, dozens of things that Jesus did. We could list healings and exorcisms and teachings and preaching and theological conversations and raising the dead and offering comfort and offering social critique and multiplying loaves and fishes and turning water into wine, all kinds of signs and wonders and miracles and teachings. We could come up with a very long list. And sometimes Christians reduce the whole life of Jesus and the whole of his purpose to one thing. They reduce it to his death. They reduce Jesus' importance to him simply dying on a cross. And they say that that is really what's important about him. But when Jesus had a chance to say it for himself, when Jesus stood up to make his debut on his own terms, he did not name dozens of things, and he did not mention dying at all. Jesus mentioned 5 things. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, Jesus said, quoting the prophet Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. That's 1. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives. That's 2. And recovery of sight to the blind. That's 3. To set free those who are oppressed. That's number 4. To proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, he concluded. That's 5 things. And then Jesus rolled up the scroll and he sat back down. In this moment, when Jesus was announcing his public ministry in the place where he had grown up to the people he had known all his life, he mentioned 5 things that he intended to do. 5 things that he felt God had called him to do. Obviously, Jesus ended up doing far more than that. Obviously, Jesus ended up having an impact far beyond those 5 things, but he did not set out intending to do everything all at once. Even Jesus did not try to do it all. Jesus did not set out to change the whole world right away, even though he did change the whole world in the end. Jesus set out to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives, to proclaim recovery of sight to the blind, to set free the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That is it. That is the whole list. Maybe you know this psalm, Psalm 19 that Jeff also just read a moment ago. It's a beautiful psalm, as psalms tend to be. It's a moving description of the natural world and the wonders of creation. This psalm, it begins with the sun. The sun, as we all know, the sun is a giant ball of gas that's undergoing nuclear fusion in a reaction that has been going on for almost 5 billion years. If the sun had a purpose statement, it would be simpler than Jesus' purpose statement. The Son's purpose statement would be to burn. That's all the sun wants to do. It wants to burn and burn and burn. The sun wants to burn until it collapses under the weight of its own fiery exhaustion. And yet, the psalmist says nothing about burning. The heavens are telling the glory of God, the psalmist says, something that is probably not part of how the sun thinks about itself, if the sun thinks about itself at all. The heavens are telling the glory of God. Day by day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. In the heavens, God has set a tent for the sun, which comes out like a bridegroom from his wedding canopy, like a strong man runs its course with joy. And we kind of know what the psalmist means, right? We kind of get it. We too have received some knowledge from the sun. We too have been edified by its movements in the sky. I have seen sunrises that have taught me things, and I have felt inspired by the way the sun's rays beat down in the July heat, the way the sun filters through the snow after a Colorado storm. So how do we account for the difference between the sun's purpose and the sun's effects? How do we bridge that gap between the sun's only desire, which is to burn, and our experience of the sun, which the psalmist so beautifully captures, our experience which goes so much beyond that burning? The sun does more than it intends to do. The sun does much more than it even sets out to do. It does all the rest by focusing on the burning. The sun does it by doing the thing it is set on doing, by burning in the same way Jesus did, in the same way, I think, in the same way we do. By focusing on purpose, all the rest falls into place. We have this statement of purpose that we read together a few minutes ago, this statement of purpose that we crafted together not that long ago to capture what it is we think we are up to together. It's an important thing to say together out loud what we think our business is, to agree amongst ourselves about our purpose and to announce it to the world. We are a welcoming spiritual community, we say. That's one thing. That actively cares for one another, our neighbors and the earth, that's two. We engage in meaningful worship and spiritual practices, we say, that's three things. We pursue social and earth justice through acts of service and advocacy, that's four. And we create space for diverse expressions of belief. That's five things that we say we do, five things that we say we are for, five things that we have identified as our purpose. And just like the sun, and just like Jesus, we end up making a difference in other ways too. We end up showing up in a lot of other ways, but that's a pretty solid statement of purpose. It's ambitious even. We do community, we do worship, we do service and advocacy, we create space, and we care for each other and the world. One of the things I think is true about purpose is that purpose can change. That happens to all of us, I think, as we move through the stages of our lives. When we're young, we spend time being formed into the people we are and the people we want to be. And in those times, our purpose might be to develop habits and gain knowledge and find opportunities that will help us along our way. And then our purpose might shift to something more like finding love or getting established in a career or refining the habits and the knowledge we gathered earlier. Some people spend decades raising children or shepherding a particular project or building a business, and then at some point, our purpose shifts again as we move out of the worlds of careers or active parenting or as we reinvent ourselves yet again. We are always renegotiating purpose and shifting our focus, which is one of the things that keeps life interesting. And churches are no different. Churches go through cycles and stages just like people do. Churches shift purpose in different phases of their lives, just like we do as individuals. And churches, like humans, always need to be discerning and defining what it is we think we are called to do. That's why we went through that process a few years ago of examining our mission and our purpose. That's why we articulated together anew the mission and purpose statement that we read, or the purpose statement that we read a few moments ago. And that's why we continue now and into the future to discern together what it is that we think we are here to do. Our purpose and our mission are not the same today as they were 10 years ago or 50 years ago, and they shouldn't be. And this is the real key. Our purpose won't be the same a year or 5 years or 10 years or 50 years from now. The things we say we are about, the things we focus on, the things we devote our time and our resources to, they change as we change, they evolve as we move through the world, and they shift to meet each new moment that God's world brings our way. When we talk about church these days, this church, but not only this church, but also the broader world of religion, when we talk about church these days, we usually talk about the church with the language of decline. We use a vocabulary of defeat or failure. We talk about how far we have fallen from some earlier ideal, usually an ideal located somewhere in the 1950s. When we talk about church these days, we so often tell a story of how we have fumbled the dreams and lost the mission of the past, how we can no longer measure up to whatever it is the people who were in this place 50 years ago or 75 years ago thought was important. We tell a story of failure, we tell a story of unraveling, of things falling apart, we tell a story about loss and decline and the gradual erosion of someone else's purpose. But there is a difference between continuing the past and living into the future. There's a difference between conserving an inheritance and discerning and creating a new reason for living. There's a difference between living out a zombie history the way things used to be until we finally waste away. There's a difference between that and finding new ways of life. In this story about Jesus in the synagogue of Nazareth, when it comes time for him to think about the past and how the past moves into the future, Jesus does not use the word continue. Jesus does not use the word perpetuate. There in the synagogue of Nazareth, when it came time to talk about the past and how it relates to the present and the future, Jesus uses the word fulfilled. Jesus is reading a really old book. The book of the prophet Isaiah was already 500 or 600 years old by then. Jesus is talking about a tradition that is already really old, just like this church's tradition is already really old. But instead of using words like continue or perpetuate or maintain or extend or preserve or endure, instead of using any words like that, Jesus speaks of fulfillment. The past is not dragged along, but it is transformed and it is fulfilled. Today, he says, today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. Jesus is not proposing to take over the synagogue of Nazareth or to make sure the synagogue of Nazareth never goes out of business. Jesus is not proposing to live out the dreams of the people who built the synagogue of Nazareth in perpetuity. He is not proposing to offer any institutional immortality. Instead, Jesus speaks of fulfillment. Jesus announces that the dreams and the visions of his ancestors would find new expression in his new ministry among many others like it, where the visions of ancestors might find fulfillment. Jesus announces that the words of an ancient prophet would find new meaning in his mouth. Jesus announces that the purposes of good news to the poor and release to the captives and sight to the blind and freedom for the oppressed would all take shape in a future that he was imagining. It's a subtle difference, I think, between living out a zombie kind of history and fulfilling the dreams of both the past and the future by living into the future. It's a subtle difference, but it's an important difference. It's the difference between dragging the past into the present and using the past as a stepping stone to something new. Futures can never only be a maintenance of the past. Futures have to be chosen, and if we choose them well, the past will find fulfillment that it never could have imagined. The sun wants only to burn, and yet it gives us warmth. It orders our days and our nights. The sun makes us feel things. The sun inspires poetry. The synagogue of Nazareth was stones stacked on top of each other, and yet it found a moment of fulfillment in the life of a young man named Jesus. This church has a long history of purpose, a long story of valuable mission, and still in this moment, it falls to us to decide who we are and how we want to show up in this world next. It falls to us to choose our purpose and define our mission. That purpose will change. That mission will shift as it should and as it must, and it is by choosing our purpose today that we can offer fulfillment to the people who came before us. It is by living out our purpose. It is by choosing to burn and to burn and to burn and to give light to new days. It is that way that we can fulfill the dreams of our ancestors for this community. That we can live into the dreams we dream for ourselves, and that we can give shape to the dreams that God places in our hearts. May it be so. Amen.